pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horse, and man was the lord of the earth. He made him an hollow skin from the heart of an holy tree. He compassed the earth therein.
The second Primordial album, Journey's End, which was recorded in 1997, almost didn't really happen. In fact, the band, you could say, almost broke up before we even got there, but somehow managed to drag ourselves to the point of making it with really little more than half an album prepared. This is the story of that record and how it came to pass. Imrama, the debut album, came out in 1995 on Cacophonous Records. And it was really quite a strange experience because we didn't really play any gigs for it. You were kind of, well, you weren't kind of. We were in Ireland, we were isolated, we're off on the periphery, the edge of Europe, and the whole Ryanair phenomenon, even though when you look, it states that Ryanair began sometime in the 1980s. I wasn't really aware of it until maybe 1996 or 1997 even. And there was cheap flights, but there wasn't really, there weren't booking agencies knocking down our door trying to book us. There'd been talk of a couple of gigs around the first album. We're supposed to play in Paris. We're supposed to play one gig in Germany. But transferring money, all that kind of thing, trying to pay for flights, it seemed like an insurmountable obstacle to climb back then in 1994, 1995. Despite, in many ways, society being easier, things like that were without doubt, much more difficult. So we hadn't played anywhere for the album Imrama. We'd lost our drummer, Paul's brother. He had disappeared somewhere in 1997. And we also had moved from Cacophonous to Misanthropy. It's quite complicated because the record contract we signed for Imrama with Cacophonous was a 40 to 50 page, mind-bendingly complicated piece of antiquated, archaic English that I tried to read one day on the train going home and just couldn't really fathom it. And this is what happens to bands, is they're young, they're 17, 18, 19, and they sign a record contract because they're just excited. And they sign away their futures because they don't really understand what's going on. Which we actually did with that very first album for Cacophonous. But through some arrangement between Tiziana, who ran Misanthropy Records, and Neil, who ran Cacophonous, we were just allowed to move. The contract was nulled and void. Stuff which we don't really understand quite how it happened. For some reason, Tiziana was starting to, then up Misanthropy Records. She'd moved to Suffolk, just outside London. And I think was just looking for bands and seemed to sort of like our debut. Like I said, it was all pretty naive. It was pretty innocent in many ways. We hadn't been on tour. Maybe if we were in Germany or Holland, it's one of the things I say or said in the beginning of the podcast, or I say to people in interviews, is that if you were from, let's say, Utrecht, or just pick Maastricht, you're a thrash band in 1991 from Maastricht in Holland, you can drive across the border very easily and play. You can trade a gig with a band who are playing their local bar or the local youth hall or something like this, and you could travel around and trade gigs with people. It was much easier if you were from the European mainland. If you're from a kind of peripheral country like Ireland that required flying, things were a little bit difficult, much more difficult to sort out, to fix flights. Paying €400 or €500, let's say £300 for a flight back then is equivalent of paying like €800-900 for a flight now, maybe €700. Although things are moving back towards those kind of costs, the Ryanair phenomenon hadn't really come into pass yet. We began to play some shows in Europe in 1999. We played in Wacken in 1998 off the back of Journey's End. But as of this time, it was all pretty naive. We barely understood what monitors were. We played a couple of pub gigs, that kind of thing. But Journey's End, the second album, it was recommended to us that we should go to. We'd been to mix Imrama in Academy Studios, the very first mix of Imrama, which exists somewhere on a cassette that should be released for some people who are interested to hear, was kind of rejected by Cacophonous. They kind of went, what the fuck have you guys done? We'd recorded the album on 2 8-tracks on a half-inch reel. And we'd the story is way back in Agitators Anonymous episode 1 or 2. Me and Nihil from Cacophonous had taken hired a half-inch machine, gone up on the train from London to Leeds, carrying this thing around with our 2 leather trench coats and leather pants, pushing it on its little wheels through the Saturday night mayhem of Leeds, with people filing out of sports bars and stuff ready to kick our asses. Like I said, go back and maybe find that in one of the very, very first few podcasts, because it's an utterly ridiculous situation. But we were then a little bit familiar with Academy Studios. It was where, of course, Academy was where Paradise Lost, where Madame Bride and Anathema had gone. So, of course, those bands were our... I'm not going to say quite our peers, but certainly we felt a lot of kind of kinship with those guys, even though those bands had had a massive head start of a year or two on us with much bigger albums and all that kind of stuff. There was, I suppose, a sort of musical lineage between those guys and where we were in Ireland. This kind of miserableism, let's call it that. And so when it was said to us, well, you should go to Academy Studios. Now, the old Academy Studios in Bradford was kind of like a 2-floor, like a normal building in the middle of a suburban housing estate. Pretty grim, to be honest. And you all stayed in a small little room in bunk beds with no windows. And you had the downstairs recording area, which was like this sort of ghostly, mystical sort of space that you sort of had the feeling that some ill history had happened there. Something dastardly had happened in this room, and had a sort of very particular atmosphere. It was a kind of shabby, down at heel place overall, but it was brilliant. It had an incredibly magical sort of atmosphere. And Mags, of course, we had got to know from mixing Imrama. An excellent person who had a really big impact. And now when I listen to Journey's End, when I play Journey's End, it's not often I play Primordial albums, but when I play the song Journey's End, I'm still caught off guard by how big and powerful it sounds. But what were we really doing? We were trying to write songs after Imrama that weren't really going anywhere. Imrama had sort of given us a certain identity. But if you listen to Imrama, it's all over the place. The opening song, Fuil Arsa, is like a rock song. You've got a song like The Fires is black metal, and The Darkest Flame has got sort of trouble, Candlemas doom elements in it. It's kind of all over the place, even though it has a particular identity. And in retrospect, I don't mind the production on it for what it is at all. But Journey's End, we began to try and broaden out the sound to make it more epic. But of course, losing a drummer in the middle of it was kind of complicated. There are some rehearsals knocking around of our early attempts at Graven Idol. I think Graven Idol was the first song that we were trying to write. And it has a sort of, again, Graven Idol is a very strange song. It's the first song on Journey's End. It's quite a complicated song with a mishmash of tempos and riffs. And this is one of the strange things about Journey's End that makes it a bit kind of magical, I think, is that if you take a song like Autumn's Ablaze or Graven Idol, there's no choruses. There's no chorus in Journey's End. All of the songs are almost all full chords. There's very little dun 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 dun. There's little heavy metal riffing almost in the whole record. It's kind of astonishing, really, when I look back at it. I mean, there are only really 4 metal songs on it. It's such a strange record. I think it's probably the strangest record Primordial ever made. In a way, we were the most unprepared. We went over there with a couple of ideas of songs that weren't really songs. So I'll kind of go through them and kind of explain the general oddness of this record. I do look back and think that it's a beautiful record. I think we had our hard edges sort of slightly honed that maybe we had from our black metal, the black metal era that we'd come from. But it does have a sort of beauty to it, if that's the right word. A sort of romantic, nostalgic, kind of wistful, melancholic beauty to it. If we look at Graven Idol, Graven Idol, I suppose, the idea was that I was going to write some sort of Edgar Allan Poe-esque sort of Victorian poem. It wasn't necessarily meant to be gothic, but I suppose in the truest sense of the word gothic, that's quite what it was. And it ended up being this sort of graven love song. And it's a very strange song. The strange timings and the bass bits at the end. I was about to sing the bass bit. Such strange chords and strange notes, and the bit in the middle. It sort of doesn't make an awful lot of sense when you put them together. And we did play it live a couple of years ago, and it sort of went down like the proverbial lead balloon. And we thought, well, maybe we shouldn't. We should leave that song alone. But it's still a cool song. I still really, really like it. It's got the vocals. I was trying to do a sort of Carl McCoy and Nephilim thing, definitely influenced by goth, by Sisters of Mercy and that kind of stuff. It's an odd and interesting song that maybe now, when I look back, could have made 2 songs or 3 songs. In fact, it probably should have made a couple of songs. But for some reason, after that first album, we were pushing out the boat with, not knowingly, but having slightly more complicated time signatures, complicated riffs. And Mags, one of the things he sat down and he said, look, you can't play these shitty guitars. You've got to use proper guitars. And one of the things he most definitely did was to peel back all of the distortion and the gain, and I suppose the black metal elements to the tone. This was kind of his way. And what he would do is he would record 2 different guitar tones quite far apart, less pedals the better, and then 2 sort of semi-distorted guitars and blend them in, which gives it this, when you listen to the opening song of Journey's End, it gives it this very tonal, very kind of rich sound. And of course he provided the acoustic guitar and all that kind of stuff. Graven Idol is a cool song, very odd song. I'm not sure we ever really wrote a song quite like it, but certainly it lays out the general feeling of a Journey's End. This is going to be an odd record. Now, Dark Song, which I think is a beautiful song that we've done a couple of times live. This was originally written by Fergal Flannery and myself, not with Primordial. It was for an acoustic project that we were doing, which we made a demo of, that does exist somewhere in very, very poor quality. And it never really went anywhere, this sort of acoustic thing idea that myself and Fergal had. And he just sort of gave it to Primordial. You can see his name in the thanks list. And what a weird decision to put this second on the record. So we open with this strange sort of gothic, open, song. And the second one is just completely acoustic. And we never really did a song like that ever again, with these layered vocals and these sort of pagan lyrics. Very evocative, and I mean, realistically, a very, very mature song to put after you've listened to the first album, to consider 2 or 3 years later that this was what was going to be the second song to open our second album. It's a very odd choice. I think it's a very brave choice, although we didn't think about that at the time. But the song wasn't even really written. It's got some strange tunings going on. If you're trying to learn it on the guitar, it's quite awkward, I think. And the poem by Emergan Glungal, the Song of Erin, fit into this whole concept very beautifully. And we began to have some drones and some bowron. And it's, in my opinion, one of the greatest sort of Primordial songs, but it was kind of completely by accident and not written by Kieran. And how strange is that? And it's how strange it is second. Autumn's Ablaze, slightly different tuning. This song we still play. We just played it in our last shows. And this became a sort of favourite song. This was, I guess, in our minds, a sort of centrepiece of the album. And this sort of opening strange dissonant riff that reminds me of sort of a Celtic Frost riff played by Voivod. At least that was ours kind of, I think it might have been our intention. But again, no choruses. It stops in the middle for this bass interlude, which has singing over it. It's really hard to describe what style it is. I mean, there's elements of 80s goth in there, there's no doubt. There's elements of Bathory, but it doesn't sound epic, like as in epic metal that the band became. As in fist in the air, shout across, an abyss to the old gods style epic. It's not that. It's kind of more personal, and the lyrics are quite, I think I was reading a lot of French existentialist writers, a bit of Camus, a bit of Sartre, stuff like this. The lyrics are not really external. They're quite internalized in a way, and they are, I'm not going to say sensitive soul type lyrics. They're not like that, but they're certainly a bit more poetic, a bit more romantic, and they belie the words written by a 20-year-old, I would imagine. And so Autumn's Ablaze became this sort of signature song, as I said, with the down tune. It's a drop tuning. I think it's C or something like this. A really strange song with this very low-pitched vocal. This is another thing you'll hear on Journey's End. I hadn't found this aggressive singing yet. This heavy vocal, this that I'd taken from 70s and 80s rock. A bit of Bad Company, bit of UFO, bit of Blackie Lawless, bit of whatever. I hadn't really applied that yet. So Autumn's Ablaze is a very sad, melancholic kind of song. Journey's End, I think, is a really heavy, beautiful song, which comes next. And that opening four really makes sense. I mean, I think it's a very strong opening four songs. Journey's End is a huge, big song about the loss of culture, losing identity, losing tradition, and about how only the standing stones will be left to tell the myths of time. It's not really a romantic song about Celtic tradition, but I think it's one of the first songs where I was kind of opening things up to sort of pan-Europeanism or a pantheistic idea that the syntax of all, or the language of all of the old gods, from whichever you may be from, have this language that echoes through time, that's attempting to speak to you on some level, and how that was being lost. So it's interesting because sometimes I talk to people from other bands who are going as long as Primordial, and they say, when I look back at the things that we're trying to say, back when we were young, the testosterone fueled aggression and satanic this, that, and the other. And sometimes people get to a little bit older and they wonder, they maybe have a couple of regrets about the things that they sang or they said, and they go, that doesn't really speak for me anymore. But I can't really say that about Primordial. I'm very proud of the fact that in our own small way, we tried to make some sort of a difference, to sing about something which had cultural, historical, traditional resonance. And Journey's End is a perfect example of that song, and something I would be more than proud to play to somebody now and go, look, here's what I spent doing my time when I was 20 years old, or however old age I was, 19 or 20. And I think these four opening four songs have a great sort of maturity. Like I said, they're lacking some aggression, they're lacking some edge of the black metal, place where we came from. But as a standalone album without those things, it's very, very interesting. It's got a sort of rich tonality. Solitary Mourner, I'm not really sure how I feel about this anymore. It's not really a song. I don't really know what I was trying to do. I think it means well, Solitary Mourner, but now it could be done quite a lot better. But I don't regret it. It's just quite odd. I'm not quite sure what I was trying to do. I think I was trying to make some sort of like sad, poetic, simplistic song that you would sing over the grave of someone. The idea was that it was part of some film, some windswept scene where some disheveled figure crows this over someone's grave. I think that's what I was trying to reach for, Solitary Mourner. Whether I did or not, again, I'm not sure. It seems like I was quite obsessed with a sort of sense of the Victorian Gothic, or a sense of the Gothic throughout this whole record. And then we have Bitter Harvest. Bitter Harvest is one of the most difficult songs to look back on. I think Kieran's riffs are huge and wide, and the opening riff is immense. And then I have sort of I won't say ruined the song, but I've written this kind of quite nasty, vile, aggressive lyrics. Some people have said it's kind of misogynistic. It's not really meant to be. It's supposed to be inspired by, as I said, this Sartre, and this Journey to the End of the Night. Who's that? Louis Ferdinand Céline. I think Céline was again a French writer. He was the main influence for Bitter Harvest. And I suppose what it was that sort of feeling of, what will you age into as a young man? How will your open-minded romantic view of the world be crushed by the dark forces that are no doubt going to turn you back into the carbon from whence you came? That was I think kind of the idea. But Kieran had anticipated some big open pagan anthem, and the lyrics and the music, I think, are the most perfect example of lyrics that don't match the music. I'm not going to say I regret them. I think it's an interesting song. I think it's a dark kind of song. I don't think we ever played it live. It's a very angry, sort of bitter song. I was trying to channel some of that antipathy, some of that sort of nihilism, some of that sort of pessimism. Nihilism is definitely a word of those writers I was reading at the time. And it's 11 minutes. Again, it could be 2 or 3 or 4 different songs. Maybe in another era we would have made this Journey's End would have been an album of a few more songs. But without a doubt, it's an interesting song. It holds us back into a little bit areas of black metal, I think. On Ashtra Dernach, which we once played at the Houses of the Holy Festival as an instrumental for 10 or 15 minutes with loads of improvisation, is an interesting song. It's a really nice piece of music. We wanted it to be about like rolling waves, rolling across, let's say, a small inlet, making your way to an island as dawn, breaks or whatever. And I think at the time, when I look back, it was a very difficult record to make because we were stuck, the 4 of us, together in a small little room for about a month. We had no money really to eat anything properly. We had no money to do anything. Bradford is a pretty miserable, horrible place. No offense to you if you're from Bradford. It was pretty grim. And the surroundings were not really very inspiring, I suppose. But Mags was incredible. He was very inspiring, and he sort of dragged these performances out of. And I think it's one of the most standalone records in the whole Primordial canon. It really just sort of, you can say Burning Season EP, Spirit and Storm kind of stand together, but Journey's End really kind of is a very standalone album. Like I said, it lacks a kind of hard toned edge, which maybe we return to in other records or maturity, but it has an incredible, I think, sort of romance to it. And I don't mean that as in a fake sense, but it has this kind of mythological romance, or a kind of doomed romance feel to it. A doomed romance. I suppose you could say that a gothic element is seeping across it. A literary gothic inspiration is quite evident in the lyrics, and it's got a sort of tragic beauty that now when I listen to, I wonder what the fuck we were doing sometimes. But I think we're all very, very proud of this record. Now, of course, then there was arguments about the cover. We wanted a particular cover, and the label were like, what the fuck, no way. And in the end, the cover was printed on the promos, but they changed it to something else at the last minute. Now, at the time, it really pissed me off. And it should have pissed me off because of the nature of the label just deciding, no, you as the artist don't know what you're doing. But when I actually look back now, I think there was one particular cover which Stephen O'Malley made, which was a kind of druidic figure heading through some stones, standing stones, which was a kind of shrouded in a sort of element of mystery that probably would have fitted the record better. And maybe at the time I didn't quite realize how it sounded to other people. I had this picture of this old man that I wanted that as the cover, but it doesn't really make sense when you consider the age we were to have such a world-weary cover. It's a strange thing, but certainly maybe the decision of the record label to change it to this unusual cover with the trees, maybe that fitted better. Ultimately, I'm willing to admit that maybe they were right at the time and probably I should have listened. But you're 20, you think you know everything, and they were saying like, look, this image is kind of like commercial suicide. And I suppose that was something that encapsulated so many of the bands back then, the Ulvers and the Arcturuses and whoever else, and this kind of this idea that, hey, we know what we're fucking doing, back off, etc. And well, it's an album that is loved by quite a many people at the time, and by many people who don't like the sort of chorus driven, more epic, more aggressive era that the band maybe moved into. They like this sort of slightly more rounded atmosphere, kind of autumn toned. How can we say that? Journey's End feels like a sort of, it has these sepia tones to it. It's got a sort of romantic edge to it, and I think that appealed to a lot of people at the time. And I can see why. And listening back before I decided to, ramble this off, it really struck me how some of it is really excellently produced by Mags, and how at the age of only whatever we were, 18, 19, 20, it's an incredibly mature record, but yet sort of filled with a sort of melancholic optimism. Anyway, Journey's End, Album 2, recorded in 1997, and I think came out in the first few months of 1998. Well, my friends, that's Agitators Anonymous, and that's just a ramble across the album Journey's End. Go and listen to it right now.